In this video, we'll go over 10 cards that have the most amount of words in their card text. And to make things kind of fair, I'm only going to pick 4 pendulum monsters, since pendulum monsters kind of have an advantage with the whole second card text spot. And at number 10, we have the Golden Castle of Stromberg. This is a field spell card which was infamous for having one of the most broken effects in the anime of nearly any card ever shown, except maybe some of the god cards. Its real-life version, though, isn't anywhere near as broken, but still does a lot of things, which gives it a score of 116 words in its card text. Now, rather than read off the paragraph that is its card text, I will instead summarize it for you. While this card is out, during your main phase, you can give up your normal summon to special summon a monster from your deck who has Golden Castle in its card text. Also, while this card is out, if your opponent attacks, that monster is destroyed and your opponent takes damage equal to half the attack of that monster. So it's just a blanket protection of all attacks. That also just straight up destroys any monster that tries to attack. And thirdly, it has a maintenance cost, where during your standby phase, you have to banish the top 10 cards of your deck face down, which is kind of the appropriate maintenance costs for the kind of protection it gives you. So the card has 2 effects and an unusual maintenance cost, so it needs a lot of text in order to tell you what it does, giving it an unusually high word count and the longest word count of any spell card. And at number 9, we have Toon Dark Magician Girl. For Toon Dark Magician Girl, she actually got an errata to her card text in order to make it smaller. Its original card text, though, clocked in at 119 words, 3 more words than the Golden Castle of Stromberg. And what contributed to the blow to the original card text was that Dark Magician Girl was released at a time in which Toon monsters still had kind of a convoluted card text to explain what Toon monsters did. All of the original Toon monsters needed to say a few things. 1, you needed to have Toon World on your side of the field in order to summon the card. 2, you could special summon the Toon monster from your hand, and if the Toon monster was level 5 or higher, it needed a tribute for the special summon. Number 3, if the card Toon World on the field is destroyed, this card is also destroyed. Number 4, if your opponent does not control a Toon monster, this card can attack your opponent directly. And those were 4 of the 6 effects it needed to cover, as Dark Magician Girl was in the Phase 2 of the Toon monsters. All of the Phase 1 monsters had these 4 effects as well, in addition to 2 other ones, including Summoning Sickness, where they couldn't attack the turn they're summoned, and that they had to pay 500 life points in order to declare an attack. Toon Dark Magician Girl didn't have these 2 requirements, and instead, it had its Dark Magician Girl effect, where she gained 300 attack for each Dark Magician and Magician of Black Chaos in either player's graveyard. And since Toon Dark Magician Girl was the first Toon monster to have an effect, they left off the Summoning Sickness and the pay life points to attack just to fit Dark Magician Girl's effect on the card text. And even then, it was still one of the longest card texts in the game at the time. And because of this, Toon Dark Magician Girl is the only Toon monster who can attack on the same turn it's summoned, and has the good first gen Toon monster effect of allowing it to special summon itself from your hand. And because its card text was so long, that kind of unintentionally made Toon Dark Magician Girl one of the best Toon monsters. And in case you're wondering, Toon Dark Magician Girl's current effect after its errata only has 75 words. Number 8, Phantasmal Lord Ultimitl Bishbaalkin. This is a synchro monster that is always treated as level 12 and clocks in at 120 words in its card text, giving it only 1 more word than the original Toon Dark Magician Girl for its card text. And the reason this card has so much text is because it has extra words to tell you that it's treated as level 12, and it summons tokens, which use a lot of letters in order to signify the token stats. Now, in an effort to never read these cards on this list all the way through completely, let me summarize what this card does. This card cannot be synchro summoned normally, and instead, you bring it out by sending 2 monsters with the same level that is over 8 to the graveyard, with one of them being a tuner. It cannot be destroyed by card effects, and gains 1000 attack for each monster on the field, and once per turn during both players' main phases, it can fill the board with tokens. These tokens have no attack or defense and are special summoned in defense position, so with a clear field, this card can give itself 10,000 attack with these tokens it can summon. But it also can't attack the turn it uses this effect, so you can't use them to OTK your opponent after giving it 10,000 attack. Now, despite this card having a somewhat inflated word count due to it giving stats to all the tokens, all the other cards on this list with longer card texts don't have anything to do with tokens. It's just this card happened to have a longer effect, an unusual summoning requirement, and it just happened to summon tokens, which all just take a lot of card text to explain. Number 7, Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal, clocking in at 122 words in its card text. This card had such a long card text that its original printing was one of the few Exceeds monsters that didn't have a separate line for its material costs and its effect. It was all just on the same line. And despite the fact that this card has an incredibly long card text, its effect is pretty simple. Basically, it has an alternative summoning condition which takes up a lot of card text to explain. It can mill one card from your deck on a spell speed 2 effect, and it floats into a Burning Abyss monster when it dies. So if it only has these 3 simple effects, why does it have so many words to signify this? Well, because of all the restrictions it has. It has an alternative summoning condition which allows you to rank up a Dante monster by sending a Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard. The Exceeds materials of the original monster get attached to Beatrice, and it can't activate its mill effect the turn it ranks up with this alternative summoning condition. Its mill effect is pretty standard. Just once per turn during either player's turn, you can detach an Exceeds material to mill any one card from your deck, which is a great effect, and the reason this card is currently limited on the ban list. And then its last effect allows you to special summon any Burning Abyss monster from your extra deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. Half of the card's text is just to go over its unusual summoning condition, which is basically a normal rank up with extra steps. Extra steps and a restriction, because they knew its spell speed 2 effect was really good. Number 6, Cyberse Clock Dragon. Cyberse Clock Dragon has 129 words in its card text, making it the longest card text of any fusion monster. This card has 3 effects, its first being, you mill a number of cards from your deck equal to the link rating of the monster used for this card's fusion summon. Then it gains 1000 attack for every card sent to the graveyard, and your other monsters can't attack the turn it uses this effect, since you can gain a lot of attack power from this effect. Its second effect is, if you control a link monster, your opponent cannot target other monsters you control for attacks or card effects. And finally, this card can float into any spell card from your deck. Now, with only 3 effects, it's a wonder why it has so much card text, when it really boils down to an effect to gain attack, an effect that gives it protection, and an effect that allows it to float. But what really adds to the word count of this card is the convoluted nature in which you gain attack, and the unusual way it gains protection. Its floating effect is pretty standard though. As you'll notice, a lot of these cards with long card texts have multiple effects, and usually the ones that are making this list have card effects that are unusual, so they require a lot of words to describe what they're doing, in addition to having multiple effects. And at number 5, we'll have the first pendulum monster on this list, and that's DDD Super Doom King Bright Armageddon, clocking in at 135 words combined with its pendulum and monster effect. Now, there's also another DDD monster called DDD Super Doom King Dark Armageddon, who has 129 words in its card text, making it tied with Cyberse Clock Dragon, and a couple of other DD monsters with similar high card text count, but I'm only going to include Bright Armageddon because it has the most, and I'm heavily restricting the amount of pendulum monsters that will be on this list. Otherwise, the entire list could just be pendulum monsters, because they kind of cheat with having 2 rows of card effects. Now, let's go over Bright Armageddon's effect. Its pendulum effect is that if your opponent declares an attack, you can target a DDD synchro monster you control, then destroy all your monsters with a defense less than the attack of that monster, and inflict 1000 damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed. And for its monster effect, it has 3 effects. The first being, your opponent cannot target your monsters with card effects, giving you a really nice blanket protection. Its second effect, if a monster is summoned, you can make your opponent choose a pendulum monster they control, and then all other monsters they control will have their effects negated permanently. And lastly, if this card is destroyed, you can place it in your pendulum zone instead of sending it back to the extra deck. This is one of the few pendulum synchro monsters in the game, and a lot of the pendulum extra deck monsters have effects that allow them to be placed in the pendulum zone instead of returning to the extra deck. And so, With a grand total of 4 effects, 2 of them being somewhat unique, they require a lot of card text to explain, making it the 3rd most amount of card text on a Pendulum Synchro monster. At number 4, we have Orea, the Sylvan High Arbiter, clocking in at 140 words in its card text, making it the most amount of card text for an Exceeds monster, and enough card text to beat out a lot of Pendulum monsters, surprisingly. Also surprising for a card with one of the longest card texts is it only has 2 effects. The first being, you can send a plant-type monster from your hand or field to the graveyard to look at a number of cards on top of your deck equal to the level of that plant-type monster, and then stack them on top of your deck however you want. Its second effect is that you can detach an Exceeds material to excavate up to 3 cards from the top of your deck, and then send any plant-type monsters to the graveyard, and if you do, you can bounce a same number of cards on the field as the plants sent to the graveyard with this effect, and then place the other cards that weren't plant types on the bottom of your deck in any order. So, seeing as this is a Sylvan card, it's most likely intended for Sylvan decks, and Sylvans are all about plant-type monsters who have extra effects that are activated when they're excavated from the deck. So this card works perfectly in stacking the top of your deck to be a Sylvan plant-type monster, activating their excavated effects and also bouncing some cards in the process. So it doesn't exactly do anything unique. A lot of the Sylvan cards have effects which relate to excavating cards from your deck. It just goes to show these 2 particular effects require a lot of words to describe very simple concepts, and it just happens to give it one of the longest card texts in the game. And at number 3, we have Odd Eyes Winged Dragon. Another Pendulum Synchro monster, this one clocking in at 142 words, only 2 more than the previous Exceeds monster. Odd Eyes Winged Dragon has 4 effects, so first let's start with its Pendulum effect. While it's in the Pendulum Zone, if a monster you control battles, you can basically give it the Honest effect, where that monster gains attack equal to your opponent's monster's attack. So that's kind of really good, as it works on any monster you control and not just a light type monster like Honest. And for its monster effects, the first being the standard Pendulum Synchro effect, where it goes into the Pendulum Zone after being destroyed instead of going back to the extra deck. And then its next 2 effects are effects that you have to choose one or the other to activate per turn. Its first being, you can negate the effect of a monster your opponent controls until the end phase. Its other effect is that if this card is synchro summoned during the battle phase, you can destroy all level 5 or higher monsters your opponent controls, which is a little bit more of a situational thing. I think it's because it has this choose one of 2 effects thing that it has a little bit more card text than normal, on top of a card that probably would have already had a lot of card text anyway. There's something about these Pendulum Synchro monsters that are just loaded with card text, as we'll see on the number 2 spot on this list. And at number 2, we have Nirvana High Paladin, clocking in at 146 words in its card text, and making it one of the most amount of words until the number 1 card was released. This card has 5 effects and an alternative summoning condition, which would really explain why it's so much card text. First, let's go over its Pendulum effects. While in the Pendulum Zone, if a Pendulum monster you control attacks, it can't be destroyed by that battle, and you take no battle damage. Its second Pendulum effect is if a Pendulum monster you control attacked, all your opponent's monsters lose attack equal to that Pendulum monster's attack until the end of the turn. So with this effect, you can have one of your Pendulum monsters crash into an opponent's monster, not destroy itself due to the first effect, and then lower the attack of all your opponent's monsters for the turn, so you can attack over them with your other monsters. Pretty decent effect. Now into its 3 monster effects and the alternative summoning condition. This is a level 10 synchro monster that requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner synchro monsters. But you can substitute the tuner with a Pendulum summoned Pendulum monster. Now into its 3 effects. If this card is synchro summoned using a Pendulum summoned Pendulum monster tuner, you know its alternative summoning condition, you can add a monster from your graveyard to your hand. If this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can have your opponent's life points. And lastly, it has the Pendulum Synchro Monster effect, where if it's destroyed on the field, you can put it in your Pendulum Zone instead of sending it back to your extra deck. So with 5 effects and an alternative summoning condition, you can see why this card had the longest card text in the game for quite a while. But wait until you see the number 1 on this list. And at number 1, we have Endymion, the founding Sorcerer Supreme, clocking in at 183 words in its card text, nearly 40 more words than Nirvana High Paladin. You may have noticed, but all of the previous cards on this list had very small incremental increases in card text between each other, except for this one, which has vastly more than the number 2 spot. Now recently, as of writing the script for this video, they announced a couple of other monsters in the same archetype as this one, with many of them having almost as long card text as this one. And some of them might have more, I doubt it. But for the sake of this list, I'm only going to talk about this one and assume it has the most. So what makes this card have the longest card text in the game? Well, let's go over its effects. Technically, this card only has 4 effects, but some of these effects take place in multiple parts. And a good example of that is its pendulum effect, as its pendulum effect is technically 1 effect, but it takes place in 4 parts. Firstly, you can remove 6 spell counters from the field to special summon this card from the pendulum zone. Then, you can destroy cards on the field up to the number of cards you control that you can potentially place a spell counter on, and if you destroy those cards, you can then place spell counters on this card equal to the number of cards you destroyed, and you can only use this effect once per turn. So a very wordy first effect that technically is all tied into the same effect, but does 4 different things. Removes 6 spell counters, special summons a monster, destroys cards on the field, and then applies spell counters. This alone would count for a pretty wordy card text, and is 71 words long, making it near the amount of words on modern day Toon Dark Magician Girl, with its 75 word card text. Now into the monster effect. Its first effect is if your opponent activates a spell or trap card, you can return 1 card you control with spell counters on it to your hand, and if you do, you can negate the activation of the card and destroy it. Then, you can place spell counters on this card equal to the number of spell counters that were on the original card that you returned to your hand. Its next effect is protection, where it can be targeted or destroyed by card effects while it has spell counters on it. And lastly, it has a floating effect, where if this card with spell counters on it is destroyed by battle, you can add a normal spell card from your deck to your hand. Now, its monster effect alone clocks in at 112 words, which is the exact same amount of words as Timaeus the Knight of Destiny, another card infamous for its long card text, and only has 4 less words than Golden Castle of Stromberg, the number 10 card on this list. So what contributes to this card's incredibly bloated card text is its effect of returning cards with spell counters and then distributing those spell counters to this card. That little gimmick of this archetype takes up a lot of words to describe, even if the effect itself is pretty simple. It's just on top of that, it also has 4 effects. So of course it would have one of the longest card texts in the game, a card text that is only matched by other monsters in its archetype, that I'm sure when they're probably translated, might match this card in text, or even surpass it. Or at the very least come close. Alright, and that's the end of this video. Now, it was pretty difficult to search for cards of the most amount of card text, since you can't exactly sort the cards by their card text count, or at least I don't know of a way to do it, but I basically just had to copy and paste a lot of card text into word counter in order to find out these numbers. So that being said, I could have missed some cards with incredibly long card text that didn't make this list, and if you think I missed one, I'll have a list of a whole bunch of other cards in this video's description along with their word counter number that didn't quite make this list, if you're curious about some other cards that you think should have made the list. And as always, if you have any ideas similar to this one, I'd love to hear about them as well down in the comments.